Akihiro and Yasuko Miyazawa were known as the perfect family, a loving couple raising two bright children, Nina and Rei, in a quiet Tokyo neighborhood. But on the night of December 30th, 2000, their home became a slaughterhouse, their lives stolen, in a crime so brutal and bizarre that it would haunt investigators for decades. The killer didn't just murder them. He lingered, eating their food, using their computer, and leaving behind a mountain of evidence without a single clear answer. More than 2 decades later, the mystery remains. Who was he and why did he choose the Miyazawa family? On the morning of December 31st, 2000, an eerie silence filled the quiet Setagaya neighborhood in Tokyo. The streets, usually bustling with families preparing for New Year celebrations, were unusually empty. Many residents had traveled to visit, relatives leaving only a few homes occupied. Among them was the Miyazawa household, a 2-story home nestled near a park. From the outside, everything seemed normal, but behind the closed doors of that house, a horrifying crime had taken place. The first sign that something was wrong came from Yasuko, Yumi Miyazawa's mother, who lived in the adjoining house. She had been trying to reach her daughter for hours, but there was no response. Worried, she decided to go next door and check on the family. As she entered through the unlocked door, a chilling wave of dread washed over her. The house was in disarray, and the unmistakable smell of blood filled the air. What she saw next would forever be burned into her memory. Inside, the entire Miyazawa family, Father Akihiro, Mother Yumi, and their 2 children, 6-year-old Keiko and 8-year-old Riku, had been murdered in cold blood. Their bodies were found in different parts of the house, each displaying signs of brutal violence. Blood was smeared across the floors and walls, marking the gruesome struggle that had taken place. It was clear that the killer had not only taken their lives but had also spent hours inside the house afterward. When police arrived, they were immediately struck by the sheer brutality of the crime scene. Akihiro was found lying in the living room, his body riddled with stab wounds. His wife Yumi and their daughter Keiko were discovered nearby, their injuries indicating they had fought desperately to survive. Upstairs, young Riku was found, lifeless in his bed, his small frame untouched by the chaos that had erupted below. The scene was unlike anything investigators had ever encountered, but what disturbed them even more was the strange behavior of the killer. Evidence suggested that after slaughtering the family, the perpetrator did not flee immediately. Instead, he had lingered in the home for several hours. He had eaten food from the refrigerator, including ice cream and melon. He had used the family's computer, visiting websites and checking emails. He had even left bloodied clothing in the house as if he had changed before leaving. The house bore no signs of forced entry, leading detectives to question whether the killer had been someone known to the family. However, nothing appeared to be stolen. Cash and valuables remained untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. The crime seemed disturbingly personal, yet no clear suspect emerged. Forensics teams worked tirelessly to collect evidence. They found multiple fingerprints and traces of the killer's DNA on the victims and various objects. Footprints left behind suggested the perpetrator had worn a specific brand of athletic shoe rarely sold in Japan. The knife used in the attack was identified as one from the Miyazawa household, indicating the killer had armed himself only after breaking in. Despite these clues, the perpetrator had managed to vanish without a trace. The neighborhood, usually peaceful and safe, was thrown into a state of fear and paranoia. Residents questioned whether the killer had been watching the family before the attack. Some recalled seeing an unfamiliar figure near the house days earlier, but no one had paid much attention at the time. With the streets nearly empty due to the holiday, there were no witnesses to the crime itself. As night fell over Setagaya, a heavy unease settled over the city. The police, despite their efforts, had more questions than answers. What kind of person could commit such a brutal act and then calmly linger in the victim's home? Why had they left behind so much evidence yet remained unidentified? And most importantly, would they strike again? The horror of that night would mark the beginning of a case that would haunt detectives for decades to come. Forensic investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the events of that horrific night. The first thing they noticed was the sheer amount of evidence left behind by the killer. It was almost as if he had been careless or had no fear of being caught. His fingerprints were found on various surfaces, from the computer keyboard to the kitchen counter. Bloodstains, both from the victims and the suspect, were scattered throughout the home. The most baffling piece of evidence was the clothing left behind: a black sweater, a scarf, a hip bag, and a hat. Each item was carefully analyzed, but none provided a direct link to any known suspect. The killer's footprints became another crucial clue. The shoe prints left at the scene were from a rare type of athletic shoe, one that had only been sold in limited numbers in Japan. Detectives tracked down every store that had carried the brand, hoping to find a record of purchase that could lead them to the murderer. Despite their best efforts, no useful lead emerged. The shoes had been available in different countries, raising the possibility that the suspect was not a local resident. DNA analysis provided another strange revelation. The sample collected from the crime scene suggested that the suspect had mixed ancestry, part East Asian and part European. This was highly unusual in Japan, where such genetic backgrounds were rare. Investigators hoped this detail would narrow their search, but once again, they hit a dead end. No known criminals in Japan matched the profile, and without an international DNA database, the suspect remained a ghost. The crime scene itself was a mystery. The point of entry appeared to be a second-floor window, where the intruder had cut through a screen to gain access. It was a risky move, considering the possibility of being seen or heard. However, the Miyazawa house was located near an empty park, and most neighbors were away for the holidays, making it an ideal target. The way the killer moved through the home suggested familiarity, as if he had studied the layout beforehand. Yet, there was no clear evidence that the family had known him. Even more bizarre was the suspect's behavior after the murders. Instead of fleeing immediately, he stayed inside the house for hours. He raided the fridge, eating ice cream and drinking tea. He used the family's toilet without flushing, leaving behind further DNA evidence. He even logged onto the family computer, browsing websites as if nothing had happened. At 10 a.m., hours after the murders, he attempted to book tickets for a play. The unsettling calmness of his actions suggested either extreme confidence or complete detachment from reality. The timeline of the attack remained unclear. The family had last been seen alive in the evening. Sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight, screams were heard by a neighbor, but they assumed it was just a family argument and did not report it. The attack likely happened within this window, with the killer remaining in the house until early morning. He left behind his clothing but took the murder weapon with him. Despite the brutality of the crime, there was no clear motive. The Miyazawas were an ordinary family with no known enemies. Akihiro worked for a marketing company, while Yumi was a homemaker. Their children were well-behaved and had no history of trouble. The randomness of the attack was what made it so terrifying. Police considered several theories. Some believed it was a personal vendetta, though no suspects emerged. Others suggested it was a random killing by an unstable individual. There was even speculation that the killer had mistaken the Miyazawa house for another target. The method of attack, using a knife from the home and staying afterward, hinted at a psychological disorder. It was rare for a murderer to linger at the crime scene unless they felt no urgency to leave. Despite the overwhelming amount of evidence, none of it brought investigators closer to identifying the perpetrator. The Setagaya neighborhood, once peaceful and safe, was now gripped by fear. Residents locked their doors, afraid that the murderer might still be lurking nearby. The case, which should have been solved quickly given the evidence, instead became more perplexing with each passing day. Detectives knew they were dealing with a highly unusual criminal, someone who had planned the attack yet acted with reckless abandon. The question that haunted them most was whether he would strike again. As weeks turned into months, the Setagaya massacre continued to baffle investigators. The amount of evidence left behind should have made identifying the killer straightforward, yet every lead led to a dead end. The public grew restless, demanding answers, but the police had little to offer beyond speculation. They knew the killer had left behind his DNA, his clothing, his fingerprints, and even the remnants of the food he had eaten. Despite all this, he remained a ghost, slipping through the cracks of every investigative method available. The case quickly gained national attention, with media outlets dissecting every known detail. Crime scene analysts tried to reconstruct the timeline of events, but nothing made sense. The way the killer moved through the house suggested a mix of precision and carelessness. He had entered through a second-floor window, likely using the nearby park's fence to climb up. Yet, despite such a calculated entry, his actions afterward were shockingly erratic. He had attacked with extreme brutality, stabbing his victims dozens of times. Yet he did not flee. Instead, he stayed, wandering through the house as if he had all the time in the world. He used the computer, browsing websites with no apparent urgency. He left his clothes behind, but no one knew why. Was it an attempt to throw off investigators? Or had he simply lost track of time? Some experts believed he might have been under the influence of drugs or alcohol, though no evidence supported this theory. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the way the Miyazawa family had fought back. The forensic reports showed clear signs of resistance, especially from Yumi and her daughter Keiko. They had struggled against their attacker, leaving scratches and bruises on his body. This was evident from the blood found throughout the home. Some of it belonged to the suspect, likely from wounds inflicted during the attack. Investigators hoped this would be the key to identifying him, but even with advanced DNA testing, they could not match the profile to anyone in their records. Detectives began to explore more unconventional theories. Some believed the killer was a foreigner, possibly someone who had entered Japan illegally and disappeared after the crime. Others suggested he might have been a drifter, someone without a permanent address, which would explain why he had left behind so many personal belongings. But if that were the case, why had he used the family's computer? And why had he stayed so long after committing such a horrific act? Theories about the killer's motive varied wildly. Some believed it was a random act of violence, possibly committed by someone mentally unstable. Others suggested a more sinister explanation, that the killer had a personal vendetta against the Miyazawa family. But no matter how deeply they investigated, they found no enemies, no grudges, no hidden secrets that could explain why someone would want them dead. Another strange clue was discovered months later. A ticket stub from a nearby train station was found inside the Miyazawa home. It was from a recent journey, suggesting the killer had traveled to the area before the attack. Investigators reviewed security footage from train stations, searching for any suspicious individuals, but nothing conclusive came from it. The lead, like so many others, went cold. As the months passed, the case grew colder, and the once dedicated task force began to shrink. New crimes took priority, and the Setagaya massacre faded from headlines. But for the detectives who had worked the case, it was impossible to forget. The sheer amount of evidence, the brutality of the crime, and the eerie behavior of the suspect all pointed to a murderer who was either incredibly intelligent or completely unhinged. Even though the physical investigation had slowed, forensic experts continued to examine the evidence in hopes that new technology might one day provide the missing link. But with no fresh leads and no clear suspect, the case remained a haunting mystery, one that refused to be solved. The Miyazawa home, once filled with life and laughter, stood empty, a silent reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls. The community had moved on, but the shadow of the crime still lingered. And somewhere, the killer remained free, his identity still unknown. Years passed, but the mystery of the Setagaya family massacre refused to fade. Detectives came and went, each hoping to be the one to finally crack the case, yet the identity of the killer remained elusive. The evidence had not changed. The fingerprints, the DNA, the clothing, and the crime scene itself still held the same unanswered questions. Theories continued to circulate, but none led to a breakthrough. Forensic technology had improved, and investigators revisited the case with renewed hope. They ran the suspect's DNA through international databases, hoping that someone somewhere had been arrested or registered under the same genetic profile. But once again, the results came back with nothing. The DNA sample remained unique, belonging to no known criminal, no missing person, no official record in any system. The killer might have been someone who had never been in trouble before, or someone who had meticulously avoided detection his entire life. Despite the lack of progress, investigators were convinced that the suspect had left behind something they had yet to fully understand. His choice of clothing, the way he ate from the family's fridge, and the fact that he used the computer, each detail pointed to a level of comfort that was unnerving. Most killers acted with urgency, knowing that time was against them. But this individual had shown no such fear. He had sat in the home of the people he had brutally murdered, eating their food, navigating their digital world, and moving through their space as if he belonged there. As new detectives joined the case, they began analyzing the psychological profile of the suspect. Experts believed he had an unusual mindset, possibly one detached from reality. His behavior suggested someone who did not fear consequences, someone who might not even see his actions as wrong. This led to speculation that the killer could have been suffering from a severe mental disorder, or even some form of dissociative condition. Some investigators began to wonder if the killer had targeted the Miyazawa family for a specific reason. The randomness of the attack seemed unlikely. Was there something about Akihiro, Yumi, or their children that had made them a target? The family had no known enemies, no ties to crime, and no controversial history. Yet someone had entered their home, murdered them with shocking brutality, and then lingered as if he had no reason to worry. A strange theory emerged. What if the killer had been inside the house before? Some suggested that he might have visited the home before the attack, possibly even broken in previously without being noticed. If this were the case, he could have spent time learning the layout, understanding the movements of the family, and choosing the best time to strike. But why? What kind of person would go to such lengths only to carry out an act of senseless violence? The case continued to attract media attention, especially as advancements in forensic science brought hope that new techniques might reveal something that had been overlooked. Investigators revisited the physical evidence, analyzing it with the latest technology. They re-examined the footprints, trying to determine the exact movements of the killer as he navigated the house. They looked at the fibers on his clothing, hoping they might reveal where he had been before entering the home. Yet, every new effort ended the same way, with more questions than answers. The suspect had managed to leave behind an overwhelming amount of evidence, but none of it led to him. It was as if he had disappeared the moment he left the house. He had no digital footprint, no paper trail, no known connections. Whoever he was, he had either gone into hiding or had never been a traceable person to begin with. The Miyazawa house remained abandoned, a chilling monument to the crime. The neighborhood, once a quiet and peaceful community, had changed. Some residents moved away, unwilling to live near the site of such a brutal murder. Others stayed but avoided speaking about it, afraid that acknowledging the horror would invite it back. The memory of the crime lingered, and with each passing year, the question remained, would the killer ever be found? 2 decades had passed since the brutal murder of the Miyazawa family, but the case refused to fade into obscurity. It remained one of Japan's most haunting unsolved crimes, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Detectives who had worked the case in the early years had long since retired, leaving behind stacks of reports, crime scene photos, and a trail of dead-end leads. But every so often, the case would resurface, drawing in a new generation of investigators determined to crack the mystery. With the advancement of forensic technology, authorities attempted to analyze the DNA again, running it through newly developed systems that had successfully solved cold cases in other parts of the world. There was hope that even the smallest piece of overlooked evidence could finally reveal the suspect's identity. But just like before, the results led to nothing. The DNA belonged to no known individual, no criminal record, no database match. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air the moment he left the house. Despite the lack of progress, online communities and amateur detectives had kept the case alive. The internet had become a hub for theories, with thousands of people from around the world trying to make sense of the crime. Some believed the killer had to be someone familiar with the Miyazawa family, arguing that the level of comfort he displayed in their home suggested prior knowledge. Others insisted it was the work of a transient, someone who had no ties to the area and had moved on without leaving a trace. A new theory emerged, suggesting that the suspect may have had military or paramilitary training. The way he entered the home, the brutality of the murders, and even the choice of weapons hinted at someone with combat experience. Some pointed out that Japan had U.S. military bases nearby, leading to speculation that the killer might have been a foreign soldier who had since left the country. However, no official evidence ever supported this claim. Over time, investigators focused on one of the most chilling aspects of the crime: the killer's behavior after the murders. His decision to remain inside the house, browsing the family's computer, eating their food, and making himself at home defied all logic. Some criminal profilers suggested that he may have been in a dissociative state, detached from reality, acting as if he had not just committed an unspeakable act. Others believed he was taunting investigators, leaving behind an overwhelming amount of evidence as if daring them to catch him. The Miyazawa home had remained untouched for years, frozen in time. The family's belongings still sat where they had been left on that fateful night. A thin layer of dust covered everything, a haunting reminder of lives that had been violently cut short. Occasionally, curious onlookers would visit the area, staring at the now abandoned home as if hoping to find answers hidden in its walls. Despite decades of investigation, the case remained open, and authorities continued to encourage anyone with information to come forward. But as time passed, the likelihood of solving the case grew slimmer. The killer, if still alive, would be older now, perhaps even deceased. If he had managed to evade capture for this long, he may have disappeared into obscurity, carrying his secret to the grave. The Setagaya family massacre was no longer just a crime. It had become a ghost story, a chilling legend whispered among those who remembered. It served as a reminder that even in a world filled with technology, surveillance, and forensic advancements, some monsters could still walk free. For the detectives who had spent years chasing a shadow, the case remained an open wound, a mystery that haunted them even in retirement. The image of the Miyazawa family, once filled with life, remained frozen in crime scene photos, waiting for justice that might never come. The streets of Setagaya had moved on. The world had changed, but one question remained unanswered and unresolved. Who had done it and why?